Hey, deep divers. Welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be looking at ESG ratings in the UK.
Yeah, this should be a good one.
We've got a pretty interesting stack of docs this time around.
We do. We've got last year's consultation document, the draft legislation, and
And the government response?
the government response. Yeah, just this month.
So pretty cutting edge stuff.
Yeah, very much so. It's fascinating to see the UK taking the lead in regulating this market. ESG is growing so fast, and it's projected to hit, what,
33 point?
$33.9 trillion
Wow.
globally by 2026.
Yeah, that's a lot of influence.
Yeah, a huge amount. So it's great to see the UK government taking steps to make sure this is all, above board and credible and reliable and so on.
So our mission today is to really untangle this proposed regulatory
Yeah.
regime. And I guess let's start with the basics. What exactly are ESG ratings?
Well, it's a good question because, a lot of people think of it as, is this company good or bad? But it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
It's really about how companies manage ESG risks and opportunities, things like extreme weather or, the rise of clean tech as an opportunity.
Hmm.
But it's also about the impact these companies have on the world around them, their carbon emissions, how they treat their employees, all sorts of things like that.
Right. So unlike a credit rating, which is solely focused on financial risk, ESG is multidimensional.
Yeah, exactly. It's much broader. And I think it's interesting that even in the consultation document, they acknowledge this. They talk about ratings, scores, marks, assessments, opinions, solutions, all these different terms being used.
Yeah, it's a bit of a linguistic jungle.
Yeah, it really is.
So why is the UK stepping in to try to regulate this?
Well, the government is saying that ESG ratings are becoming so influential, they're impacting markets and investment decisions.
Makes sense billions of pounds are being allocated based on these scores.
Exactly. So they're concerned about a lack of transparency. How are these ratings actually calculated? What methodologies are being used?
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's a potential for conflicts of interest.
Well, you know what if a provider is also advising the company of their rating?
Oh, yeah. That seems like a big problem.
Yeah, it could be. So regulation is aiming to address all of that to boost confidence in ESG ratings
Yeah.
and really to cement the UK's position as a leader in sustainable finance.
Okay, so let's dive into the heart of this regime, the scope. Who's out? What's the FCA going to be looking at?
Yeah, so the draft legislation defines providing an ESG rating as a specified activity subject to FCA oversight.
Okay.
Meaning if you're producing an ESG assessment that is available to someone in the UK and it's likely to influence an investment decision, then you are probably on the FCA's radar.
Okay, and it doesn't matter if it's requested or not, or if it's done by an algorithm or something.
Yeah, that's right. The key thing is whether it's likely to influence investment decisions.
Okay, so even those AI-powered ratings are in scope.
Exactly.
I see.
And this regulation covers a broad range of financial instruments, all the usual suspects: shares, bonds, loans, insurance contracts, pensions, the whole shebang. Wow, so this is not just a small corner of the market.
No, it's a significant chunk. And here's where it gets really interesting. The scope includes both UK-based providers and overseas providers serving UK users under a business relationship.
So even if you're not based in the UK, but you're selling your ratings to UK investors, you're still subject to UK regulation.
Exactly. And this wasn't even in the original proposal.
Oh, wow. So they've really expanded the scope.
Yeah, they're serious about this. They're sending a clear message. If you want to influence UK investors, you have to play by UK rules.
Okay, makes sense. But I'm sure there are some exceptions.
Of course, there always are.
Let's walk through those because I imagine this is where it gets tricky.
Yeah. So first up, we have regulated products and services. The idea here is to avoid double regulation.
Okay.
So if a firm already has FCA permission for something like credit ratings, they can provide ESG ratings as part of that existing service.
Right, so they don't have to get separate authorization for ESG rating.
Exactly. But they can't sell them as standalone products.
Okay.
It's all part of the same package.
Interesting. Now, what about charities?
Yes, charities. This was a tricky one. There was a lot of debate about this during the consultation.
I can imagine.
Some argued that charities pose the same risks as any other provider and should be subject to the same level of scrutiny, while others said charities often lack the resources to comply with full regulation.
That's a tough one.
It is. The government ultimately decided to exclude charitable activities, recognizing the potential burden on these organizations, but
Yeah.
this exclusion only applies when ratings are not provided as part of a business relationship.
Ah, so if a charity is essentially operating like a for-profit provider, charging for their services, they'll need to comply with the regulations.
Yep. That's
Right.
right.
Okay.
Well, I'm
Makes
fine.
sense. So next we have internal or what they call intra-group ratings.
Yeah, ratings created for a firm's own use or within its corporate group, those are excluded.
Right. So companies can analyze their own ESG performance without being subject to external regulation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If those ratings are made available to third parties, then they fall back into the scope of the regulation.
So it's all about whether those ratings are being used to influence the wider market.
Precisely.
Okay. And what about bespoke or private ratings?
So if one entity asks a provider to rate just them, and it's only for their internal use,
Mm-hmm.
that's excluded.
So it's like a confidential report card.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But if they share that rating with anyone else, then it becomes subject to the regulations.
Okay. So again, it's all about public versus private.
Yep. Public distribution changes the game.
Got it. And next up, we have accreditation or certification schemes like energy performance certificates.
Right. These are generally excluded because they serve specific non-investment purposes.
I bet there's an exception.
There is. If the primary purpose of the scheme is to influence investment decisions, then it's back in scope.
Okay, so it all comes down to intent.
Yeah, exactly. How are these assessments being used in practice?
Makes sense. And finally, we have public authorities, central banks, international organizations.
Right, these are generally excluded.
I guess because they're not operating for commercial gain.
Yeah, exactly. And their assessments are unlikely to be directly influencing investment decisions in the same way that commercial providers do.
Okay, so they're kind of in a separate category.
Yeah, you could say that.
All right, so we've covered the who's in, who's out, but I'm curious about how the government plans to make sure this regulation is fair and proportionate. We have these massive global players, and then we have smaller, more niche firms.
Mhm.
How do you create a level playing field?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was a big focus of the consultation. A lot of people raised concerns that smaller providers might struggle with the costs and burdens of regulation.
Right, it's like asking a corner shop to follow the same rules as a supermarket chain.
Exactly, and there were worries that this could stifle innovation
Mm.
or give larger players an unfair advantage.
So did the government come up with a solution?
Well, they considered a few options.
Yeah.
Lighter touch rules for smaller providers were on the table, and they even looked at an opt-in system. But ultimately, they decided on full FCA authorization for all providers.
Okay.
But they emphasized that the FCA will take a proportionate risk-based approach to supervision.
Okay, so it's not one size fits all.
Exactly. It's a sliding scale.
Got it. Well, this is incredibly helpful in understanding the scope of what the FCA will be looking at, but I'm curious about the specifics. What are the actual requirements these providers will need to meet? How will they demonstrate transparency and accountability?
Yeah, those are great questions, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into in the next part of this deep dive.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Well, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground today, laying out the who and the why of this regulatory regime. In part 2, we'll delve deeper into the specifics of those requirements and how the FCA plans to ensure transparency and accountability in this rapidly evolving market. So grab another cup of coffee and get ready for another fascinating deep dive.
See you there. Welcome back, deep divers. So last time we untangled the which providers will be subject to the FCA's oversight and which activities are actually going to be regulated.
Right, and we've got this draft legislation here, but it's pretty dense stuff. Can you give us the layman's version? What's the FCA actually going to be looking for from these providers?
Well, they're really focused on transparency. They want a clear picture of how these providers operate. So they're going to be looking at methodologies, data sources, and how conflicts of interest are managed.
Okay, so it's about making sure those ratings are robust and reliable. No more, black boxes.
Exactly. Investors need to understand what's driving those scores, especially given how much money is riding on these ratings.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, one of the first things they'll be looking at is governance. Making sure there are solid processes in place to ensure quality and integrity.
Like a quality control system.
Exactly. They'll be checking for things like clear responsibilities within the organization, robust data management procedures, clear processes for handling complaints.
Makes sense.
They'll also be scrutinizing how providers engage with the companies they're rating.
Right, you don't want any behind-the-scenes deals or undue influence.
Exactly. It needs to be an unbiased and transparent process.
And speaking of conflicts of interest, that was a big concern raised during the consultation. What kind of rules can we expect to see around that?
Well, transparency is key. They'll have to disclose any potential conflicts of interest.
So financial relationships with rated companies,
Right.
ownership structures, things like that.
Exactly. They need to lay it all out on the table. But disclosure isn't enough.
Right.
They'll likely impose rules to actively prevent or manage conflicts.
Yes, yes.
For example, they might restrict providers from offering certain consulting services to companies they also rate,
Mm.
or they could require them to implement internal barriers to prevent information sharing between different parts of the organization.
Okay, so it's about building those ethical firewalls.
Exactly. Investors need to be confident that the ratings are objective and unbiased.
So we're starting to see the contours of a pretty robust regulatory framework.
Right.
But will this lead to more standardization in the ratings themselves? Will everyone start using the same methodologies and producing similar scores?
That's a good question, and there were some people who argued for a more standardized approach.
Right, so like a universal ESG rating system.
Yeah, but the government pushed back on that. They recognized that ESG is multidimensional and there's a diversity of approaches out there.
Makes sense.
Forcing everyone into the same box could stifle innovation.
Right, you don't want to kill creativity.
Exactly. So the FCA's focus is on transparency and robustness, not on dictating a specific methodology.
Okay, so they're setting the guardrails, but not the exact route.
Right, providers will still have some flexibility, but they'll need to operate within those clearly defined boundaries.
Makes sense. But is there any area where we might see some convergence?
Potentially in the disclosure of underlying data and assumptions?
Ah, so shedding light on those black boxes?
Exactly. Investors want to know how those ratings are calculated.
Mm-hmm.
So the FCA is likely to push for much greater transparency in this area. Providers will need to be very clear about the data points, the weightings, the assumptions that underpin their assessments.
So it's like providing an ingredients list for the ESG rating.
I like that analogy. And this increased transparency could lead to more informed comparisons between different providers.
Okay, so we might not see identical ratings, but at least investors will have a clearer understanding of what they're comparing.
Precisely. It's about empowering investors to make informed decisions.
Okay, so we're seeing a push for transparency on multiple fronts: methodologies, conflicts of interest, data sources, even the engagement process with rated companies.
Exactly. The UK is aiming to create a more level playing field, boosting confidence in the market and solidifying its position as a leader in sustainable finance.
This is all incredibly helpful in understanding the nuts and bolts of this regulatory regime. But I know there are still some unanswered questions. Like, how does all of this fit into the global landscape?
Yeah.
And will these regulations truly strike that balance between transparency and innovation?
Those are excellent questions, and those are exactly what we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've really dug into the specifics of these UK ESG regulations, but I want to zoom out a bit now. How does all this fit into the global picture?
Well, it's a good question because ESG ratings are, by their nature, global. Companies operate across borders, investors have global portfolios, and data, just flows freely around the world.
Right, so trying to regulate this in isolation just wouldn't really work.
No, it would be a mess for everyone involved.
So is the UK going it alone, or are they trying to work with other countries on this?
They're definitely not going it alone. The government has been very clear about the importance of international alignment.
Okay.
They've been working closely with IOSCO,
IOSCA?
the International Organization of Securities Commissions.
Oh, okay.
They've been developing a framework for regulating ESG ratings and data products.
So kind of like a global standard setter for ESG.
Yeah, you could say that. And the UK is not just following along, they're actively involved in shaping these standards.
Makes sense. So they're making sure their approach is compatible with what's happening globally?
Exactly. They don't want to create a system that's completely out of sync with the rest of the world.
Right. So what are they doing to ensure that things run smoothly across borders?
Well, they're looking at ways to recognize overseas regimes that meet certain standards.
Okay.
So if a provider is already regulated in, say, the EU or the US, they might not need to go through the full authorization process in the UK.
So kind of like a fast track for reputable providers.
Yeah, exactly. It would make things easier for providers and give UK investors access to a wider pool of ESG ratings.
Okay, I see. But even with all this international cooperation, there's still the question of innovation. Will these regulations stifle the creativity we've seen in this market?
Yeah, that's a valid concern, and it came up a lot during the consultation. Some people worried that strict rules would favor the big players and make it harder for new startups to enter the market.
Right, it's that classic tension between regulation and innovation.
Exactly. But the government's argument is that regulation will actually boost innovation in the long run.
How so?
By building confidence in the market, clear rules give investors more certainty. They know what to expect from these ratings, and that can drive demand for new and better products.
So the idea is that regulation creates a more stable environment where innovation can flourish.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between protecting investors and fostering creativity.
And the FCA is committed to that proportionate risk-based approach, right? So they're not trying to micromanage everything.
No, they're setting the ground rules, ensuring transparency and accountability, but leaving room for experimentation.
Okay, so they're building a greenhouse, not a cage.
I like that analogy.
So looking ahead, what broader impact could these regulations have?
Well, I think it's a clear signal that ESG ratings are going mainstream. They're becoming a core part of the financial system. And with that comes greater scrutiny and the need for clear rules.
So the UK is really trying to shape the future of ESG globally.
They are, and if they can pull this off, if they can create a system that's both robust and flexible, it could become a model for other countries to follow.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is. The decisions made here could have ripple effects across the world.
Well, deep divers, I think we've covered just about everything. We've gone from the nitty-gritty details to the big picture implications.
Yeah, we've explored the what, the why, and the how of these regulations.
You now have a solid foundation for understanding this complex and rapidly evolving landscape. But of course, there's still some unknowns.
Always.
How will the FCA actually implement these rules? Will they strike that balance between transparency and innovation? How will the market adapt? These are questions only time will tell.
That's right.
But one thing is, certain ESG is here to stay, and the UK is at the forefront of shaping its future.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating time to be watching this space.
Well, deep divers, that's it for this deep dive into ESG ratings in the UK. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and keep diving deep.